The diligent farmer plants trees of which he himself will never see the fruit. Cicero. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I'd like to thank everyone who's dropping by this week. I hope you are having a good first week, I guess full week, back here to the new year. New season for us again, second episode of the new season, and it's off to a big start. And hopefully it's only going to be getting bigger for me. I've finally gotten my Apple ID issues sorted out, and I've finally been able to get the show uploaded to iTunes after 2 years, essentially, or close to 2 years. I think the 2-year anniversary is next week. I think next Monday, actually. I don't have anything really big planned, just another standard episode. So, if Apple ID is iTunes is your platform of choice, there you go. And hopefully this will bring in some new listeners as well. I know that there are a couple of other sites that use kind of iTunes as like their audio source. I think Good Pods is one. I'm going to try and take control there if it ever gets published there. But we're going to have to see. So hopefully there will be some new platforms, some new listeners coming in. But even before this episode went up on iTunes, very, very well listened to episode. I think it was over 40 downloads just to like 24 hours after. So very, very big episode, and I hope people will continue to listen and enjoy. And if this is your first episode, hopefully, I hope you enjoy the show as much as some of my regular viewers have been, or listeners. Yeah, welcome. And for those who continue to listen, again, I appreciate you guys as always. This week, we're going to be continuing our specialization episodes before we move into specific peoples and places for 6,000 to 4,000 BC or BCE. This week, we're going to be talking about the new plants that humans are beginning to tame and engineer. We did one of these last season, and we're going to continue kind of going over that for this season. Now, I think this might be a multi-part kind of thing. I had planned on kind of doing maybe 1 or 2 episodes, but it might end up being a little bit more than that. There were a little bit more plants that I wasn't expecting to be domesticated this early. And there's some that I'm not 100% sure, and I don't think people are in general 100% sure when exactly they were domesticated. So I'm going to try to be going through that as best I can. So, now I think it goes without saying that all of these plants or their wild ancestors that I'm going to be talking about have been consumed and used by man prior to this domestication process starting. But I'm going to state that here just in case. I do think I should also remind everyone, though, that getting an exact date on when the crops being grown are true domesticates is extremely difficult to pin down because early domesticated varieties may not be much different from their wild cousins. So again, the dates on these may be a few hundred years older or younger than what I'm giving. And examples of this that I'll be going into later is potatoes and corn. Both may have been domesticated before last season ended, or they may only be truly domesticated once this season gets going, basically, in 100 to 500 years after the fact. For now, though, we're going to focus on talk of agriculture in Africa. Now, as we talked about in several episodes, Africa's climate has seen far less variation during Homo sapiens' existence, and it has mostly escaped the effects of the Younger Dryas, which affected North America, Europe, and North Asia far more than it did affect anything, I guess, in Africa or to the south. But there was some environmental changes outside of Africa. Africa saw a little bit, but by and large, it's not really changing too much. And again, that's not just climatically; that's ecologically as well. And of course, necessity being the mother of invention, and by and large, most people living in Africa this season haven't had to shift from our traditional hunter-gatherer mindset. And it's true that the number of megafauna had decreased in Africa, but they were still there, and in some cases, there are still megafauna living there today. The elephant being a prime example. Of course, though, again, these are reduced numbers. So most humans living in Africa didn't need to experiment with agriculture just yet. However, that day will be coming fast, and by the end of the season, they will begin to make their own progress to horticulture and then into true agriculture. Now, indigenous African agriculture emerges in 3 areas: the Sahel, West Africa, and in and around the Ethiopian highlands. Now, I am not including the Nile in this despite it being in Africa, because the evidence for agriculture found there shows that they were growing crops almost entirely from West Asia, the Middle East, what have you, whatever you want to call that area. But again, they're going to kind of get more focused later. And it is that's the reason that Africa kind of isn't considered a cradle for agricultural expansion, because most of the crops that Africa uses stay in Africa. They don't begin to expand out of Africa until much later than, say, the crops grown in the Middle East. The Middle East, they've already domesticated wheat and barley, and they've exported it again to Africa. They've started to exporting it to Europe, and there is evidence again that they're also exporting it to other parts of Asia. And then you have the agriculture centers in China, or what is now China. They are going to be exporting their crops north and south, and a little bit to the east and west as well. And then, of course, we've talked about corn a little bit, or maize, the technical term for it. That starts, of course, very localized in Mexico, and then that spreads out into the rest of South America and then into North America. So Africa's crops take a little bit longer to exit the continent. That's why they aren't usually grouped in. Well, there are other reasons, but that's why I'm not including them, because their crops don't reach out of Africa until later in human history. And even then, only really East African crops escape, or not escape, but are taken out of Africa, in later periods. And then, of course, you have the colonial and the explorational period by European peoples. That's another big factor in spreading West African crops to the rest of the world. But we'll get to all of that much, much later. So, I do need to point out that it is possible that early agriculture could have been practiced by groups living in what is now the Sahara Desert, because at this time it was still temperate enough in many places to have, tried to practice agriculture. It may have been, it would have been very similar to the Sahel, and even more green and fertile, where there were rivers, streams, ponds, and lakes. Of course, desertification of the area makes archaeology hard, so I don't know that we will ever find much evidence dating to this time in the Sahara region. But I would not be surprised in the least that if one day it was discovered that some peoples were practicing some kind of that early horticulture or semi-sedentary seasonal agriculture. And the spread of the desert is probably one of the factors that led to the rise of agriculture in West Africa and the Sahel. People having to move west and south in greater numbers for longer and longer periods meeting peoples that were already living in those places probably put huge strains on the resources in the areas to the east and south. So that is probably one of the big necessities that we talk about enforcing the spread of agriculture. Now, in terms of crops they were working with and starting to domesticate, the first big one we should mention is sorghum, or it is also sometimes called as broom corn. There are around 30 varieties of this worldwide, and that includes wild species. Some strains were domesticated outside of Africa slightly later, but the oldest domesticated strains we have found were located near the Gash River in what is now the Sudan, near the modern city of Kassala. Now, other groups in Africa domesticated their own strains later, but again, this is a couple of thousand years from this period. Now, the oldest domesticated strains that we have can be dated to about 3500 BC. And there's a mix of wild and semi-domesticated species dating back to between 5 and 4000 BC near the same site. And sorghum, like corn, is technically speaking a grass. Some varieties are used as animal feed, and others are used for more human consumption. The sprigs that kind of shoot off from the stalk have been used to make dusters, sweepers, and brooms, hence the name of broomcorn. Now, sorghum is very, very tolerant of heat, so it is well suited to growing in arid or semi-arid environments. And it should be noted that although early in the growth process, it can be dangerous for humans and animals to eat. It does eventually, of course, mature, and it is, it's safer to eat. But the reason you can't eat it early in their growth process is because they have a lot of nitrate and cyanide during kind of the early stages of its development. So if you eat too much of it too early in its growth process, you will die, or you will kill animals if you feed it to them enough. Though eventually kind of the pearls or seeds become milky and opaque, and then you can eat them directly. Eventually, if you let them mature too long, they begin to taste bad, and then you need to either grind them into flour or boil them and eat them like nuts. We talked about that kind of with the importance of pottery. Now, people in several regions have also used the leaves of these plants to develop dyes. So that gives another use to growing sorghum in addition to their substantial nutritional value. Most of these dyes are green, which you would expect from leaves, but there is a variety of sorghum in Nigeria that has red leaves, and so they use that to make a very vibrant red dye. And of course, today, sorghum, I believe, is the 5th most grown cereal crop in the world. And I believe Africa has 2 of the top 5 producing. I think it's Africa. I need to double check that. I didn't include that in my notes, but I think I remember seeing that. I believe, though, the United States does grow the most sorghum today, though it is not any African strain, because there's nowhere arid enough, I think, to kind of properly grow that. Now, the next plant I'm going to talk about is going to be a little bit more controversial for a couple of reasons, but I feel that it does merit a mention. The primary reason that this is kind of controversial is that its exact date that it became domesticated isn't known. In fact, I don't think this plant, in fact, I know this plant doesn't enter the historical record until the 1400s. The other reason that it will be controversial is that as time has gone on, the plant has been abused by both individuals and groups to something that is not necessarily something that is for survival or health. It is something that is used a bit more maliciously. This plant is cot. And cot grows from shrub-like trees. It's native to eastern and southern Africa. And they can be anywhere between 3 and 16 feet tall, which is, I believe, between 1 and 5 meters. Now, cot isn't a foodstuff, like most of the plants that I've talked about. But it is also a very different kind. But it's similar to flax in that it is being grown and domesticated for a purpose that is not food. So it's kind of it's a non-food crop, but it is an important one that is domesticated. And I talked about it, flax, in last season's plant domestication episode. So I felt I kind of needed to do something that showed that all the crops being grown in Africa kind of also fall into this kind of secondary usage, or a usage that's not primarily nutritional. Now, again, the plant's domestication date is extremely debated / mysterious, but we have been using the wild variety in at least some small doses, if not more, for probably our entire existence, or at least the people living where the plant grows have been using it. I'm personally of the opinion that since agriculture is emerging in the Ethiopian highlands at this time, there is a greater than 0% chance that humans weren't trying to control the cot trees in the same way they were trying to control other important plants. And this would probably not be a particularly hard task. Cot trees don't really require any maintenance or care beyond water and sun. It takes around 8 years for them to be fully grown, but they can produce some usable plants or leaves before they're mature. Also, fully grown trees can be harvested up to 4 times a year. So you have a tree that doesn't require much work. When fully grown, it can produce useful products year-round. So it's an ideal plant for migrating semi-sedentary groups. So yeah, I think it probably is at this earlier date range that at least some type of horticulture was being practiced. Now we come to why cot was grown. It is a stimulant containing cathepsin, and this provides a euphoric feeling. It suppresses hunger and gives energy boosts. It can also be used as a painkiller and can increase libido as well. You can chew the leaves or dry them to make tea. You can then crush them up, make pastes or creams. And then for the softer parts of the stems, you can add them to gum to flavor it, or include it with fried or boiled nuts to kind of help soften their shells and give them a little bit more flavor. Now, cot can have several harmful side effects like constipation, insomnia, impotency. If you use it too much, if you abuse it, it can also cause much more visceral health problems. For prolonged use, it can cause some forms of psychosis. It can also lead to cancers. Now, that requires quite a lot of use of it, and it will, it's not necessarily, there are a lot of plants that if you abuse them, it can lead to severe health effects. It's kind of one of the precursors to coffee in terms of like stimulants. It's not as addictive as some have made it out to be. However, certain cultures that prohibit stronger stimulants, cot kind of does not fall within those prohibitions. For example, Islam. There are certain plants and things that they can't have. Beer, for instance, fermented wheat. Cot kind of gets around those prohibitions. And cod is similar in terms of addictiveness to things like coffee or something along those lines, though its the negative health effects are a bit worse than, of course, coffee or something like that. And it can also... it's a little bit of a controversy because it is a very big cash crop in a lot of East African countries, but there are countries that treat it like narcotics. It is not quite as bad as as narcotics as a whole. And again, it's not quite as habit forming, but there are people that believe the benefits of khat usage far outweigh its negative effects. And this is something that's heavily debated. There are parts of the world that have outlawed it. There are parts of the world, where it's frowned on, but not out and out outlawed. But it is, it is a traditional kind of social lubricant, I guess, for lack of a better term. There are cultures that where men will kind of congregate and chew khat together and talk, and kind of like a early coffee house. And there are those and places in Africa, very traditional cultures, that use khat along with other substances with khat to kind of as kind of like a religious part of their religious ceremonies, things to kind of help them open themselves up to the spiritual world, to the ancestors, that kind of thing. So it is very important to those people, and it was important to the humans living at that area at this time and even earlier, and it will continue to be important. So I felt like I should include khat, even though the date might be slightly off, and because, again, it is frowned on by some societies. Now, the next crop that we're going to talk about is also from East Africa. It is, again, one of those Horn of Africa crops, or what is now Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, those kind of places. It is teff. Teff is a grass like sorghum, although it looks a lot different. It almost looks like, in some cases, weeds, although it, of course, gets much longer. Teff is mostly used as animal feed, though it does have uses for cooking and is used to prepare dishes in East Africa. Now, teff is also one of those that's a little hard to place. I think 4000 BC is right around the earliest time it could have appeared. But I think, again, this is one of those cases where at least the wild version of teff is definitely in use at this early period. And it would not surprise me for the earlier dates to be correct, hence why I am including it in this episode. Now, teff is it's actually very useful because it uses its seeds are very small, and it grows a lot from even just one seed grows a fairly large shoot, I guess, for lack of a better term. So you can plant a lot of seeds in a very small area, which is, again, why it is very useful. Now, it doesn't get very tall. I don't think it gets too much above your ankles, so it is very labor intensive to pull up if you're harvesting it by hand, which, again, kind of makes it why you don't see it grown too much as a crop for humans to eat. It is something that humans, of course, can and do eat, but it's kind of like a complementary. It's used as a base. You include other things with it. Typically, though, you'll see mostly animals kind of using it as fodder, eating it directly from fields. So it's very similar to quinoa, if people are familiar to that, although it doesn't have quite as much flowering and shoots as quinoa does. If you saw it, you would just think it was just like overgrown grass. Someone hadn't really cut their grass, essentially, if you saw it in the wild. It is still mostly grown almost entirely in Ethiopia. I think they grow over 90% of it there. Though there are places outside of Ethiopia that have begun to grow it. I think places in Spain have grown it. There are even parts of the United States, I think out in Nevada and California, and I think a couple places in Texas too, that use it. So that is another one of the big East African crops that is, at the very least, beginning that domestication process here this season. Now, there are 3 other crops that I'm going to mention. I'm not including them, though, like in detail, because I think the very earliest that we have evidence of the domestication process starting is about 3,500. So they're probably increasing their usage of the wild varieties at the very end of this season, so right around 4000 BC, but there's no evidence of semi-domesticated strain till 3500 maybe, give or take. But those are Noog or Ramtal, or Ramtila is another term for it. They have a plantain called Incente that they will domesticate in the area, as well as their own version of millet that's going to be grown in the area. Also, coffee is probably in that group as well. And again, I'm not going to go into detail on those crops because, again, there's no evidence that they've started to even try to domesticate it during this season. But those will be included on next season's episode focusing on this region. So we've knocked out sorghum, which is technically a Sahel crop. As I said, it grows in the Sudan. The Sahel is not quite as widespread as it is today. Again, it's generally greener, but that's the big crop that emerges in the Sahel agricultural region, and those crops that we've talked about in Ethiopia or the Horn of Africa region. Those are all domesticated at around this time. In terms of West African crops, which again, as I mentioned, is its own kind of agricultural ground. It has its own set of crops and plants that are being domesticated. There isn't much cause for domestication to arise there just yet. In fact, the only crop that I could find that there is considerable evidence that they're, again, in these early stages of horticulture/agriculture in West Africa at this season is the yam, which... for those that don't know, yam is a tuber. They can stay in the ground for a couple of years before they eventually rot away. So, this is something that would be very beneficial to a group of nomads. Hey, we can come here next year. These crops are still going to be here. We'll be fine. It's a way to. It's a long-term storage device essentially, and they'll still grow. You leave them longer, they'll grow more, so you'll have more food. So the yam is really the only one that's being domesticated this season in West Africa. Of course, next season you're going to see a much larger explosion of domesticated crops in this area because, again, more people moving into the area due to the desertification of the Sahara. So keep that in mind. So those are the big 3 regions of African indigenous agriculture. So that's kind of what we're looking at for plant domestication in Africa at this period. We will have a little bit more to discuss next week when we talk about Asian domestication. That one might be a 2-parter for Asia. We'll have to see. So that's what we see for Africa at this period of time when it comes to plant domestication. I think there's going to be a little bit more to talk about. Well, I'll hold off on that. I'm not going to dive too much more into that sort of thing until we get there. But yeah, so Africa, again, there hasn't really been a need for domestication to take place. In terms of population numbers, South Africa, which doesn't have like its own kind of, at least as far as I'm aware, and I haven't read any literature on it, it doesn't have kind of any inborn agriculture. Most agriculture in South Africa is imported from people coming down from West Africa, and in some cases, East Africa. So, but the people living in Southern Africa, they're probably doing better than anyone else in the world in terms of health, longevity, and maybe even in population, which is something we'll talk about. Or at least a healthy population. We'll get into that when we get to the spread of agriculture and why it is so rapid when we get there. But yeah, so I hope you've enjoyed this episode. It was a little bit, I thought I would be able to stretch it out a little bit more, but about 30 minutes, that's a good episode, I feel like. If anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free. I'm always looking for feedback. I didn't get any from, at least didn't get any critical or questioning comments from last week's episode. So just, standard people saying, hey, enjoyed the episode, that kind of thing. So if you do have anything you'd like to ask or bring up, or just, again, constructive criticism is also always welcome. Please feel free to drop me an email at waradrevpod@gmail.com. You can also direct message me on Twitter/X. You can also comment on my YouTube videos. I do read the comments there. I like to respond to those as quickly as possible. I'm at 95 subscribers on YouTube. It would be very helpful if anyone that has a YouTube account could subscribe there. I'd appreciate it a lot. And if you'd like to see my ugly mug, I do stream on YouTube. I try to do historical / wargaming stuff, some horror stuff, some fantasy stuff. Today I just completed my playthrough of Plague's Tale: Innocence, which is a kind of a fantasy medieval horror game set during the Black Plague 100 Years War period. I think 1348 in France. That was a 2-day stream. I did it some yesterday, did it today. Had a couple of random crashes, so the videos are broken up into weird portions. But yeah, I had a really fun time with it. And I'll be playing the sequel probably, if not next week, the week after. But yeah, thank you all for listening. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you have a good Monday and the rest of your week whenever you're listening to this. And I will see you all next week, where we'll continue going over some more domestication events in Asia. So yeah, thank you all for joining me. Have a good day. Goodbye.